Of all the books on whether animals have psychic abilities, this rather old one is a must-have. My copy is an ancient ex-library book, but modern copies are still in print today. It was published in English in 1914, with a long chapter on the remarkable Elberfeld Horses. Its illustrious Belgian author, Maurice Maeterlinck, seen here, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1911. The story of these horses is mind-boggling. They were reputed to calculate square roots, cube roots, and even fourth power roots of numbers with 6 or 7 figures. They could communicate in German and French, and a distinguished Swiss psychologist from the University of Geneva, Professor Eduard Claparède, seen here, called their phenomena the most sensational event that has happened in the psychological world. As the story goes, in the 1890s, Wilhelm von Osten, an eccentric retired teacher living in Berlin, taught mathematics to his Russian stallion called Hans, and in the early 1900s, von Osten would exhibit the horse's prowess at shows without ever charging admission. Reports on this amazing horse created quite a stir, even reaching England and the New York Times. But despite von Osten's living in Berlin, it was with the town of Elberfeld that Hans became associated after he moved there to live with 2 other clever horses. Elberfeld, by the way, is north of Cologne and 30 kilometres east of the town of Düsseldorf on the River Rhine. Von Osten's teaching began with a number of skittles put on a table in front of Hans, and then asking the horse to strike as many blows with his hoof as there were skittles. The results were astonishing, Dr. Claparède reported. The horse could not only count, but make calculations and solve problems. He could also distinguish harmonious musical chords from dissonant ones. And with his extraordinary memory, Hans could tell the date of each weekday. Curious scientists wanted to know if this was trickery or fraud, or was the horse simply enormously intelligent. So Oskar Pfungst, a German biologist and psychologist, set out to study Hans at the request of a committee of professors. Using multiple trials, he noted that Hans could get the correct answer even when someone other than his owner asked the question. However, he claimed the horse only got the right answer if the questioner knew the answer beforehand, and the horse could see the questioner. Pfungst reckoned that when von Osten knew the answers to the questions, Hans was correct 89% of the time. But when he didn't, Hans answered only 6% correctly. So says his report, which is still available in English as well as German. He concluded that the questioner's conscious or unconscious body language provided Hans with the cue to stop tapping his answer at the correct point. And today, when an animal demonstrates brilliance, the explanation that the handler is providing the cue for the correct answer dismisses the animal's intelligence. It's called the clever Hans effect, a term some animal trainers still use. Later, it turned out that of the supposedly interested professors, only 2 actually bothered to observe the horse for themselves. So the findings of Pfungst provide only one interpretation. However, his conclusion was satisfactory to the scientists who would have been hostile to a psychic suggestion such as telepathy. After von Osten's death in 1909, Hans was acquired by a wealthy merchant, Karl Kral, the owner of 2 Arabian stallions, Mohammed and Zarif, seen here. And he decided to train them in the same way that von Osten had used with Hans. This photograph shows all 3 horses together. Soon Mohammed could do addition, subtraction, multiplication and division. And within 4 months he could work out square and cube roots. So Kral then set about teaching him spelling and reading. The other stallion, Zarif, was a slower learner, but eventually could almost match Mohammed's ability, while the aging Hans went into retirement. And this is where Maurice Maeterlinck, who wrote The Unknown Guest, comes into the picture. A world-famous Belgian author, playwright and Nobel Prize winner, he went to Elberfeld to observe the horses for himself. Once introduced to Mohammed by his owner, the horse was asked to spell Maeterlinck's name by using taps of the hoof for each letter of the alphabet. The horse began tapping out an H, followed by an E, followed by an R. And the men realized Mohammed was spelling Herr, the German equivalent of Mr. Not surprisingly, the horse struggled with this difficult Belgian surname, first spelling Mazurluk, M-A-Z-R-L-K. When told this was incorrect, the horse tapped again, Marzleggt, M-A-R-Z-L-E-G-K. Kral then repeated Maeterlinck's name, and with 2 more attempts, the horse spelled the name with 1 error, regarded as close enough. In The Unknown Guest, Maeterlinck wrote, "What strikes one particularly is the quickness with which this strange mathematician gives his answers. The last figure is hardly chalked on the board before the right hoof is striking off the units, followed immediately by the left hoof marking the tens. There's no sign of reflection. One is not even aware of the exact moment the horse even looks at the problem. And yet the answer seems to spring automatically from an invisible intelligence." Mistakes occurred according to whether the horse was having a good day or a bad one. But when told of its errors, the horse nearly always corrected them. For example, the number 84 reversed becomes 48. But Mohammed would put this right without difficulty. With Karl Kral away from home, Maeterlinck carried out experiments by himself, wanting the horses to attempt questions that Maeterlinck himself did not know the answers to. And in this way he discounted the clever hands effect. Maeterlinck used large cards with numerals on them, shuffled them and placed them in front of the horse without looking at them himself. Without hesitation, Mohammed rapped out the correct answers to the cards, as often as Maeterlinck cared to try it, and with nobody else present there was no other mind the horses could tap into. Now we get to a mathematical complication, with a term I, in my ignorance, had not met before, a surd, S-U-R-D. It's a number with no square root. And for viewers who don't know or haven't been in school for well over half a century, like myself, here's a reminder of what a square root is. For example, 4 times 4 equals 16. So the square root of 16 is 4. 4 multiplied by itself is 16. But a square root does not have to be a whole number. For example, the square root of 44 is 6.633249580710, if you know how to calculate it. Now, a cube root example is as follows. 125 is 5 times 5 times 5. So the cube root is 5. 3 5s multiplied together equals 125. But getting back to the story, Maeterlinck unknowingly wanted Mohammed to supply a square root for a number called a surd. The horse lifted his hoof, paused, looked back at Maeterlinck, and shook his head in refusal. By refusing to continue, he challenged both the clever hands effect and telepathy from the experimenter, since there was no answer available in Maeterlinck's head. One day, Zarif stopped in the middle of a lesson from Karl Kral. Asked why he'd done so, the horse replied, "Because I am tired." On another occasion, he stopped, explaining, "Pain in my leg." Astonishing though this was, Kral and Maeterlinck were not the only experimenters with these horses. While Kral was away on a trip, tests were run by a Dr. H. Hamill, who began by giving Mohammed simple maths problems and ended by wanting the 4th power root of 7,890,481, with Muhammad's answer, 53, being correct. Amazingly, Dr. Hamill reported it took only about 6 seconds for the horse to begin striking the answer on the floor with his hoof. And on another day, Kral, under Dr. Scholler, rather naively in my view, wanted Muhammad to develop speech. The horse made several efforts before striking in German, "I have not a good voice." So they asked what was necessary for him to speak, and he replied, "Open mouth." Asked why he didn't attempt to open his mouth, the reply came, "Because I can't." And similarly, Zarif said he could not speak, quote, "because I have no voice." Metalink was flabbergasted, declaring, "You would not be more astonished if you suddenly heard the voices of the dead." At least 10 other respected scholars and scientists studied Karl's horses, and they all ruled out fraud and the clever hands effect without being able to offer any alternative solution. So in the absence of an alternative, the clever hands effect has remained the explanation by default. Metalink has studied the work of British psychical researchers. He accepted the reality of mediumship and wondered if these horses themselves were mediums through which some higher power was working. Archibald Campbell Holmes, an historian of spiritualist phenomena, thought spirit influence was indeed the most logical explanation for the Elberfeld horses. If spirits on the other side can control tables by tilting and levitating them in seances, could they also influence or control horses? So now let's consult this book, Life Eternal, published in 1934 by the deceased yet famous journalist W.T. Stead. It was recorded through automatic writing by the medium Hester Dowden. Indeed, the entire W.T. Stead story is so fascinating, I made a documentary about him, entitled Sensational Stead and the Spirit World. It's still available on YouTube. He was a controversial early 20th century British muckraking journalist and a newspaper editor who drowned in the Titanic disaster and only days afterwards began communicating from the other side. He wrote a book entitled The Blue Island through Hester Dowden, describing the afterlife, and later his book Life Eternal. Turn to page 130 and you find Stead's explanation for the Elberfeld horses. He suggests they were chosen by a spirit communicator with a mathematical education, and that this was done as a joke or a stunt, not to be taken seriously. But of course it has been taken seriously, as this discussion shows. Taking a broader look at the supposedly psychical talents of animals, it clearly interests parapsychologists. In 1929, the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology published a paper by Doctors Joseph Rhine and Louisa Rhine of Duke University, entitled An Investigation of a Mind-Reading Horse. The horse in question was called Lady Wonder, a 3-year-old owned by a Mrs. C.D. Fonda of Richmond, Virginia, seen here. Although it was not so startlingly clever as the Elberfeld horses, it was claimed that Lady Wonder could make predictions, solve simple arithmetic problems, and answer questions intelligently without verbal commands. The question simply needed to be written down and shown to Mrs. Fonda. The journal's abstract for this paper reads as follows. By the use of screens, so the horse and owner could not see each other, and by the prevention of voice directions, the conscious signal and unconscious guidance theories were disposed of. This left only the telepathic explanation, the transference of mental influence by an unknown process. Nothing was discovered that failed to accord with it, and no other hypothesis proposed seems tenable in view of the results. And so Lady Wonder featured in newspapers, including Life magazine, seen here, becoming one of the most famous horses outside of horse racing, and helping Mrs. Fonda to a fortune. But there's often a skeptic ready to issue a denial, and in this case it was John Scarn, a conjurer and self-publicist, seen here. He noticed that the horse stood in front of a row of blocks with the alphabet painted on them, and that the answers came from the horse touching the appropriate letters with its nose. Scarn reckoned the Duke University academics had been tricked, as the owner stood slightly behind the horse. But since the eyes on a horse, being slightly on the side of its head, have a certain backward range, Lady Wonder could see her owner behind her and thus receive signals from her. Clearly, Scarn never read the abstract that I've just given, since it states clearly that screens were used, voice directions prevented, and outside guidance options eliminated. But even so, Scarn's declaring the horse's performance a mere hoax against the scientists killed off the lucrative career of Lady Wonder. But it's worth noting that these experiments were the Rhines' first attempt at forced choice testing for psychic ability, to which they later devoted many years of research, and for which the xenocards they invented became so well known. Throughout his life, Dr. Joseph Rhines' interest in animals continued, including, in the 1950s, exploring whether military dogs could use extrasensory perception to detect underground mines. Indeed, it was Rhine who coined the phrase extrasensory perception, or ESP. If you want to review the experiments of psychical investigators with animals, you could do worse than consult this review article, Emerging Explanatory Frameworks in Animal Psi Research, available online at the Free Library by Farlex. I won't go into the lengthy details, except to say that it covers decades of controlled experiments with horses, dogs, cats, kittens, birds, mice, rats, gerbils, cockroaches, goldfish, chicks, and circus dogs. Often there were positive results, but only marginally significant ones. Rats, for example, were tested for their ability to predict which side of the box they lived in would become electrified, so their prediction saved them from receiving shocks. Also, could cats influence a random number generator with just their minds, so as to obtain heat to keep them warm within their cages? Kittens were tested to see if they could tell beyond chance which bowl before them contained food. And goldfish behaviour was tested around their chance of being netted and taken out of the water. Some experiments were positively cruel, with rats expected to predict whether or not they were to be killed shortly. But such experiments are now prohibited. And of course, there's the problem of boredom from endlessly repeated tests in a laboratory. As it happens, the performance of animals in such tests drops off over time, just as happens with people doing xenocard tests. As the authors of the article report, taken as a whole, the evidence points to an animal psi effect that is small, not easily replicable, subject to fluctuations and decline effects. There are also reports in the literature about spontaneous qualitative studies taking place in natural environments, in contrast to purely quantitative testing in laboratories. Take the work of the British biologist Rupert Sheldrake, for example, whose controversial surveys have included animals knowing when their owners are coming home, from which a book has been published. One of his subjects was a dog named JT, which appeared to have telepathic powers, but others have challenged this. He also conducted telepathy tests with Nkizi, an African grey parrot having language skills, seen here. But again, Sheldrake's critics accused him of not counting all the results of his tests. Of course, with their historically close friendship with humans, dogs in particular have been credited with telepathic powers. One remarkable tale was reported by the Rhines in 1962 regarding a dog called King. He disappeared from his home in Idaho, and turned up 3 months later at the front door of the family's new home in California, a distance of 800 or 900 miles. The newly arrived dog was the size, shape and colour of King, and even had a scar in the same place, as well as displaying the same characteristic behaviours the family remembered, such as a dislike of hissing noises and a preference for shaking hands with its left paw. Despite the enormous distance entailed in this dog's trek, the family were convinced it was in fact King. Another case reported by Bektarov this time in the 1949 Journal of Parapsychology involved two circus dogs obeying their trainer's purely mental commands. By the trainer imagining the task the dog was expected to perform, such as fetching a book from a table or sitting a particular chair, he claimed to telepathically direct the dog's behaviour, even when he was blindfolded and behind a screen. He said he would take his dog's head between his hands, symbolically telling the dog it was entirely in his power. He then concentrated so as to forget the outside world, mentally impressing upon himself the object of his wishes. And then, looking deeply into the dog's eyes, he would fix into the dog's brain what he had just fixed into his own. Then I mentally give him the command, "Go," he reported. The dogs were often eager to get free during this visualization process, and usually fulfilled the objective rapidly and without hesitation. Then there's the case of Chris, the wonder dog, apparently able to give the correct response to arithmetical problems by pawing the appropriate number of times on his owner's arm. In 1958, Chris was trained to associate each card in a Xena ESP deck, like this one, with a number, and to identify face-down cards by pawing the appropriate number. When Chris's owner ran this test, the results were highly significant, even in trials where the card numbers were unknown to the owner himself. But when a parapsychologist named Cadore observed the performance, the result was significantly below chance. The reason for this is unknown. In 1964, investigations were undertaken into 5 domestic dogs reported as barking the appropriate number of times in response to the number their owners were thinking of. 3 of the 5 dogs scored above chance, even when the owner and dog were separated by a screen, a door, or were placed in separate rooms. And it's been speculated that generally the best performances occur when the relationship between the dog and its owner is really close. And now I have just one more tale. It comes from my YouTube documentary about the Irish medium Geraldine Cummins, who specialised in automatic writing. One of her visitors was the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, William Lyon Mackenzie King. And one of the people who contacted him from the other side, through Cummins, was none other than the former President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. What Roosevelt revealed was that following his death, he attended his own funeral in spirit. Nobody is aware of his being there, with the exception of his very own dog, a Scottish terrier called Fala, seen here, which was delighted to see him again. It's a strange tale, make of it what you will, and watch my documentary on Geraldine Cummins. Which brings us to our conclusion on this topic. As might be expected, the psychic animals debate has polarised into believers versus skeptics waging war on sentimental anthropomorphism, or anecdotal evidence in natural surroundings versus more rigorous findings in laboratories. Which brings us back to the Elberfeld Horses. Were they brilliantly clever? Could they simply read body language? Were they truly psychic? Or were obsessing spirits inspiring their calculations? What do you think? I don't know the answer, but thanks for listening.